Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Michael Johnson for his service to our country, as well as Dr. Carafano and General Barno, and thank you all for being here today. I just wanted to ask a straightforward question. Is the world become less dangerous, in your view? You're all national security experts. Are there less dangers out there, less risks for our country?
I'll start, Senator, and they can correct my interpretation. I think certainly compared to the Cold War, things are better. The world we're living in today, I think, is better than having a major nuclear-armed, ambitious, aggressive, expansionist superpower rival in the Soviet Union, certainly through the 60s.
But what about the 90s, even?
I think relative to the 90s, I would say things are a little tougher today.
More dangerous than the 90s?
Yes.
Yeah, I would agree, Senator. More dangerous than the 90s, very unstable and volatile, and we're not sure what's going to happen next.
Right.
Well, again, I stated before, I think it's certainly no less dangerous than it was in the 90s, and that's why I'm concerned that a force which was inadequate then would certainly be inadequate now.
All three of you, how good have we been at predicting our next conflict, historically?
You know, people tend to say we're horrible at it. We've certainly made some big mistakes, which is reason enough to assume we'll get it wrong again. We've gotten it right sometimes. We planned for a second war against Iraq for 15 years, and we had one. We've planned not to have a second war against North Korea by making sure we stayed ready for it, and we've successfully deterred it.
For example, do we predict the Korean War?
Not the first time.
No.
The first time we almost half,
or even World War I.
Let it on.
World War II. Some of the major conflicts we've been involved in, we haven't been particularly prescient.
Yeah, I'd say less than 50% track record.
What do the other? What do you?
No, absolutely. That's one of the most difficult parts of military planning, and inevitably we get surprised. And the key is how quickly can you adapt once you're surprised.
And so, you know, given that we haven't, you know, at best 50%, I'm not sure. We haven't been very good at predicting the next conflict. Can you all comment to me where we seem to be shifting our overall viewpoint that has in the past been a bipartisan viewpoint of being ready for 2 conflicts versus a 1+ conflict situation. And in my view, given our not too great track record of predicting where we're going to be involved, is that wise? And the other thing that I think is encompassed in that decision is one of the things that's troubled me about where we are right now is I serve on the Armed Services Committee as well, and Chairman Dempsey testified before that committee and Secretary Panetta about the 2013 budget and the $487 billion in reductions. And he has required the chairman to submit a risk assessment to Congress. And both of them told us, you can't cut $500 million from the Department of Defense and not take on risk. Yet we have yet to receive the risk assessment, and I'm supposed to make decisions to make sure that we responsibly protect our country. So in your view, should we not have the risk assessment? What risks are we taking on with the initial $487 billion? And I think it relates to my first question of, is it wise really to be in a position where we're changing what has been our readiness posture for this country?
I think the two-war construct is often misconstrued. It's often looked at as a strategy when it was never really intended to be that. It was just a force-sighting mechanism, and it was a measure of capacity. And so again, I can only speak from experience, is we're going to go back to a force that's about relative capacity of what we had in the 1990s, and that was an inadequate force structure for the end of the 1990s. When Kosovo happened, I remember very senior officers sitting around saying, how are we going to do this? We can't do this. And that was a 17,000-man ground commitment, and nothing like what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. So if the 90s are any measure whatsoever, that force structure is inadequate for day-to-day business and has nothing to do with forget about fighting 2 wars. We won't be able to do day-to-day business.
General?
I'm sorry. I'll be brief.
Doctor, which
I think you're asking excellent questions that get right to the heart of it, and there's no definitive answer because we don't know exactly how many were the right answer in the old days. We don't know how many today. The way I would put some perspective on it is to say that the portfolio of likely risks has shifted, I think, a little more towards the maritime and irregular domain. So in the 1990s, we had to worry about an overland threat, again, by Saddam to Kuwait, for example, as well as a North Korean threat to South Korea. Iraq is still obviously in turbulence, so is the whole region, but the more likely set of scenarios there now, I think, is more maritime or irregular counterterrorist. North Korea remains a huge menace, and I am not among those Americans who say that we can sort of reduce our potential role in a future Korean conflict dramatically just because North Korea is atrophied, because they have now 8 nuclear weapons perhaps. But the South Koreans have really picked up their role in the alliance as well. So on balance, I think that peninsula is roughly comparably demanding to what it had been before. So I think the portfolio of risk has shifted more towards maritime and irregular domains, where we still have to have simultaneous crisis responsibility for more than one potential problem at a time.
I would just add to that, number one, I think you're right to ask for the assessment because I think that's critical to make the judgments that you're going to be required to do here on Capitol Hill. I think in terms of the new strategy, it does make some choices and it does rebalance our global portfolio a bit, obviously with a focus on Asia for the rest of this century, but also recognizing that the Middle East is going to continue to be a very volatile, dangerous part of the world. We're going to have military forces prominent in both of those theaters. What it also does, though, is it says the remaining elements of the world, our European commitments should come down. Some of our commitments, perhaps, in South America shouldn't be as great. So we're beginning to shift away from some of our Cold War models of how we have forces deployed and where our costs are to focusing on what we now think are the highest priorities for the years coming up.
I appreciate all of you, and I think it's really important we receive a risk assessment so that we can understand and explain what risks we're taking on with the initial portion of reductions. And let me get, before I know my time's coming up, but this is a very important issue, and that is sequestration. We passed the Budget Control Act in our infinite wisdom here, and I can say I voted against it. And I will tell you this, that we left approximately 60% of the spending on the table. And so whether your issues are domestic or military, those portions are going to take a disproportionate cut. Sequestration. Secretary Panetta has said it will hollow out our force, that we will have the smallest Navy since 1915, smallest Air Force, smallest ground forces since 1940. Do you think it's responsible for us as a bipartisan members of Congress to allow sequestration to go forward?
You know, I'll just say 75% of the cuts in this budget are capabilities. So that means if you add sequestration on top of that, it's hard to see how it's not all just capability you're cutting.
I think the answer is absolutely no. It's irresponsible.
Thank you.
And I agree, especially because of the implications in 2013. I'm against the magnitude of the savings anticipated regardless, but what would happen to the force in 2013 is particularly unacceptable. And I actually don't like the fact we're going to spend 2012 thinking about how we would cope with sequestration. It's a waste of time. We have more important things to worry about.
Well, I agree. I think it's like we're asking our Department of Defense to plan their own demise, and that doesn't make sense in terms of our national security. So I appreciate all three of you testifying, and I will actually have some follow-up questions for you because I've got a whole host of additional questions, but I appreciate your expertise in this area.